Comes this long ZIL limousine. Out comes Gorbachev with a hat on, with a scarf on, with a coat on, and he just looks like a gnarled old man.
Ronald Reagan walked down the steps in this bone-chilling weather without an overcoat, and obviously without a hat.
Reagan looks like the future. He looks like, tomorrow.
So the pictures showed a vibrant, youthful, if you will, Ronald Reagan, and this older man who was actually much younger. I mean, you say, well, what does that matter? Oh, it matters a great deal from the standpoint of the way the world looks at leadership and the way the world looks at people.
President Reagan would later say he agreed with his friend Margaret Thatcher. There was something likable about Gorbachev. Though he quickly saw him in human terms, the president was blunt about his differences with the Soviet leader.
And all of a sudden, Reagan says, Mike, just want to talk to you about Afghanistan. And Gorbachev says, oh, what's that? And he says, you have 120,000 troops in Afghanistan. They're not wanted. They're killing kids. They're killing adults. I just think it's kind of genocide for them to be there. And Gorbachev's listening to this through the earphones, wondering, what is this? Is this a bad translation? Or, no U.S. president has ever talked that frankly to a Soviet leader. Now, having said that, we have to deal with them because they have nuclear arms and they're doing all kinds of terrible things around the world. So we're not naive and we're not going to say no talking ever. But we're not going to say they're just like us. We're not going to say, like Jimmy Carter did, we dream the same dream and we have the same aspirations for the world. Reagan knew that was ridiculous. If it was up to them, we'd be in the gulag right now. So this idea of delegitimizing the Soviet Union was a gigantic difference, and that came only from Ronald Reagan.
At the full sessions, both sides have worked hard at keeping up appearances, but even President Reagan, normally unable to resist an answer to a reporter's question, kept his mouth shut on this occasion. He'd already spoken privately of serious differences with Mr. Gorbachev.
And President Reagan told him at one point, Mikhail, you can't win the arms race. And Gorbachev said, why not? And Reagan says, because we'll outspend you.
I think it was just an act of genius on his part that he understood that when pushed, the Soviet Union was not going to be able to compete.
He saw a vision that no one else had seen, but he also had a strategy to get there. It wasn't just simply increasing the arms race to bankrupt the Soviet system. It was also signaling his commitment to mutual cooperation and a safe passage for the Soviet system out of totalitarianism.
At one point, after Gorbachev reacted angrily at the mention of SDI, Reagan suggested they walk down to a nearby pool house on Lake Geneva. There, despite their differences, they agreed to future summits.
The fact is that he really had enormous courage. He was an old man when he became president, and as an old man, you think, especially as a conservative, you think, you conserve what's been done. He was not willing to go along. He was not willing to conserve what had been done. He was a man who said, let's just do it. Let's just do it.
At a joint press conference, Reagan and Gorbachev pledged to curb the arms race and improve U.S.-Soviet relations. President Reagan left Geneva with SDI intact.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
I asked him about the time of Geneva, with his first meeting with Gorbachev, what was the most neglected part of his biography. And he said immediately the Screen Actors Guild and the negotiation he'd done for the union with the movie producers. And I said, Mr. President, what did you learn from this negotiation? And he said, clearly looking right at me, that the purpose of a negotiation is to get an agreement.
Despite his success in Geneva, criticism of Reagan now came from both the left and the right. Some conservatives accused him of being naive and ignorant regarding his arms control talks with the Soviets. But Reagan pushed forward toward his next summit with Gorbachev in Reykjavik in October of 1986.
Are you optimistic, Mr. President?
I'm always optimistic.
After an overnight session, President Reagan and Secretary Gorbachev agreed in principle to historic reductions in their nuclear arsenals.
As it turned out that next morning, Gorbachev said, I can live with all those cuts, enormous progress, more than 70 years worth, but you have to tie it all to killing SDI.
I was there representing the Defense Department and was asked whether I thought we could continue the Strategic Defense Initiative. under the restraints that Gorbachev was insisting on, that is, work only within a laboratory. And I said to the president I feared that we could not.
It's almost biblical. In the Bible, in the New Testament, it says that Satan takes Christ up to the mountaintop and says, all of this can be yours, just sign on with me. Gorbachev came and laid on the table all of the missiles. He said, let's do away with all of the atomic weapons, but of course, you have to give up your missile defense shield. Reagan said he wouldn't do it. And he left, and the look on his face, Ronald Reagan, Gorbachev said, well, can't we? Reagan said, you did this. He got in that car and he left. That was the end of Gorbachev's attempt to see if he couldn't strike a deal that he thought would be favorable to the Soviet Union. From then on, it was exit time, lights out.
The immediate reaction was that the summit was a failure. But I think Mrs. Thatcher, the very next day, if not the same day as it ended, said, no, that's not what happened. Ronald Reagan may have lost the battle, but he won the war. Because what he did was he showed what we were standing for, and we were going to stand up for it.
Gorbachev knew that he had to come Reagan's direction, America's direction, because the American arsenal of democracy was just too big for Gorbachev to compete with.
In Iceland last October, we had one moment of opportunity that the Soviets dashed because they sought to cripple our Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. I wouldn't let them do it then. I won't let them do it now or in the future.
After Reykjavik, President Reagan kept pressure on the Soviets. He sent Secretary of State George Shultz to Moscow for further arms talks.
And in Berlin in June of 1987, during a tour of Europe, Reagan challenged Gorbachev with perhaps the most famous words of his presidency within the shadow of the Berlin Wall, that for 26 years had stood as a symbol of Soviet oppression and a lack of basic freedoms.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And there were several of us on the staff who thought maybe that wasn't a good line to leave in there because we just didn't believe the wall was going to come down anytime soon. President Reagan said, that doesn't matter, I want to say it, and I'm going to say it. He was right. He was on the crest of history that day.
Can you imagine if someone had gone to that wall and faced the cameras and said, Mr. Gorbachev, come open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, please tear down this wall. But when Reagan said it, everyone thrilled to it. Everyone understood that here was someone who not only had an idea, but he knew how to project it.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union.
That winter, Secretary Gorbachev signed a treaty accepting all of President Reagan's previous terms with no restrictions on SDI. The president had followed his own path and achieved results his critics never thought possible.
For the first time in history, the language of arms control was replaced by arms reduction. In this case, the complete elimination of an entire class of U.S. and Soviet nuclear missiles. Doviai, no proviai. Trust but verify.
На каждой встрече вы это повторяете.
He understood the importance of being able to talk to your adversaries, whether they're domestic policy adversaries or foreign policy adversaries, talk to them, negotiate with them, not give away the store, make a tough deal, but make a deal and reach an agreement. As he used to say to me over and over and over again, he'd say, Jim, I'd rather get 80% of what I want than go over the cliff with my flag flying.
When President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev next met in Moscow in May of 1988, the world was rapidly changing. The Soviet Union was withdrawing from Afghanistan, and Lech Wałęsa would soon be elected president of Poland.
Sposoba uzbrojenia
He forced the arms race, and he spoke about it openly. And this actually forced the arms race onto the Soviets, and it ended up in their collapse. And in that sense, he actually played the biggest role in our way to freedom. We couldn't have accomplished it ourselves, because we were not a superpower.
And in Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution swept the communists out of power and Václav Havel into the presidency. As President Reagan had hoped, freedom and democracy were spreading throughout Eastern Europe. The Cold War was ending.
I thought that Reagan's policy was right, and that it was not giving up, and it was not giving in. And that's what I liked about it. In fact, I liked it more than the policy of appeasement, of giving in, of trying to talk to dictators to make them give a little. The policy of appeasement has been traditional in Europe, and I think it's a bad policy, and that it's often led to disasters.
On his way home from Moscow, Reagan stopped in London to acknowledge Margaret Thatcher for her help in confronting the Soviets.
And here I want to say that through all the troubles of the last decade, one such firm, eloquent voice, a voice that proclaimed proudly the cause of the Western Alliance in human freedom, has been heard. So let me say simply, at this hour in history, Prime Minister, the entire world salutes you and your gallant people and gallant nation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for the summit. Thank you for your presidency. Thank you for your testament of belief. And God bless America.
When the Berlin Wall came down in November of 1989, President Reagan had just finished his second term as president.
My view is very simple. Gorbachev deserves credit for not sending in the tanks to suppress the rebellions of 1989. But he is more effect than cause. He wasn't, so to speak, a spontaneous agent of change. He was the response of the Soviet system to the challenge of Reagan and Thatcher and the Pope.
Historians can argue about the end of the Cold War and who was most responsible. But President Reagan's prediction came true. The Soviet Union was destined for the ash heap of history.
Communism had fallen, the Iron Curtain had fallen. Our greatest enemy for 50 years had been defeated, as Margaret Thatcher said, without firing a shot.
And that was in Reagan's head. It was his plan. It wasn't something that his advisors thought up. It was pure Reagan, and I know because he said it to me before he was president of the United States that that's what he wanted to do.
Reviving the American spirit may have been one of President Reagan's most important personal goals.
He said, the greatest strength in the world is the strength of a free and confident people. And while he pointed to that, he also played such an important role in fortifying that strength by reminding the American people that they were the source of so much.
President Reagan called it a great rediscovery of our values and common sense, a theme he consistently expressed.
We came together in a national crusade to make America great again and to make a new beginning. Well, now it's all coming together. With our beloved nation at peace, we're in the midst of a springtime of hope for America. Greatness lies ahead of us.
He was somebody who really believed that he was just the impetus, he was the motivator, but that ultimately, particularly in a democracy, one man can't change everything.
He used the bully pulpit better than any other president that I've seen in modern times. Others have been effective, Bill Clinton certainly, John Kennedy certainly, and to an extent George W. Bush, certainly early on after 9/11. But they couldn't touch Reagan in the overall sense.
Even in tragedy, Reagan's words offered comfort and hope.
The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning. they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye, and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.